Thank you very much, Judith, and thank you all for coming today. So the theme of this conference is about looking to a new future for outcome measures in palliative care. But I'd like to start by just turning the clock back a little bit, just a little bit into the past, to around about 3.5 years ago when I first started working at Hospice UK. And at that time, my sense coming into the sector was that the attitude and the approach to outcome measures can really be sort of captured in this quote, which I hope you will forgive me and not think it's too tasteless to be quoting a brutal dictator, but it kind of really sums up to me what people thought about outcome measures at the time. So let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. A sort of fragmented, anything goes kind of approach to outcome measures. And so I've captured it in this picture of a meadow full of different wildflowers. It seemed that there were many different measures. In fact, I remember seeing a presentation from Fliss where she talked about a piece of research which found, I think, 116 different outcome measures in use. But of those, 99 were being used by fewer than 10 different providers. So very, very fragmented. And just, I think, different hospices were adapting and adopting their own versions, taking things which have been validated and then adapting it to how they wanted to use it locally. Others were using things which hadn't been validated at all. There wasn't really any coherent sense of which measures to use, which were the best ones, or what was the real purpose of using them. And I think there was also at that time quite a lot of complacency, but also anxiety in hospices about outcome measures. So complacency in the sense that a feeling that, well, we all know that what we do is really good. We know from the thank you letters, we know from the coverage in the local press, we know from the feedback we get from people who do events and fundraise for us, we know from our own staff and volunteers that actually we're doing a really good job, that people love what we do. So why do we need outcome measures? But also some anxiety about whether people would really understand outcome measures in palliative care. So knowing that outcome measures in palliative care are different from those in many other parts of health. It's not about looking for recovery. Often in palliative care, the positive difference that an intervention or care support can make is about preventing further deterioration, lessening the pace of deterioration, lessening the impact of symptoms. So how would we be able to explain to the outside world and commissioners, funders and others the real way that outcomes work in palliative care, and a sort of nervousness about that as well. But fairly soon after I joined, in the spring of 2013, about 6 months later, I think two things happened which were real game changers. The first was the publication of the Commission into the Future of Hospice Care in October 2013, and the second was the launch of the Oak Project. And the reason I think these were so important was for the Commission, it was a real wake-up call. I think it was a wake-up, face-up and grow-up call to the sector. Talked about the need to establish a clear evidence base about outcomes and what anticipated outcomes were and what they were expected to achieve. Talked about the need for better data, for stronger analysis, and in fact, not the full final report, but one of the sub-reports which was published as part of the Commission's work has, I think, a really clear quote saying that we need to rectify the frequently appalling lack of systematic measurement of performance, analysis of data, and use of evidence in decision making. So an absolutely clear, stark message to the sector that things need to change. And very, very soon after that, the Cicely Saunders Institute at King's College launched the Oak Project. And I think the reason why Oak was so important and so interesting was because it really cut through that 100 flowers approach. Here was a set of outcome measures which were based on years of rigorous academic and clinical research, which were really based on looking very carefully and very closely at what patients and families said was most important to them, were chosen because they were ones which were also relatively quick and straightforward to use, and offered the promise then of being able to, for the first time, systematically introduce a shared set of outcome measures across the whole sector so that people could start to learn from each other, could share findings, and eventually could move towards being able to compare in really systematic and rigorous ways through case mix adjusted benchmarking. So taken together, I think those two things added up to being real game changers. So in early 2014, Hospice UK approached Cicely Saunders Institute and said that we would really like to work together, to collaborate, to try and increase the understanding and the knowledge and the uptake of the OAK measures right across the sector. And a huge amount has happened since then. So we jointly worked to launch the Outcome Measures Resource Pack last year. Now I have to say, Cicely Saunders Institute did all the intellectual heavy lifting there, but what Hospice UK was able to do was firstly to help just refine the resources by getting some feedback on the draft materials to make sure that they really worked for those working in palliative care, and also to then help promote, support, encourage, talk up and explain about why this was so important and the value of people coming together and working with a shared set of measures. We also jointly took part in monthly webinars to help people who had bought the resource pack and were starting to want to understand how to use it and starting to have questions about how to make best use of the measures. And this year we've been launching a series of Train the Trainer workshops. We've delivered 5 out of 7, and by the end of November we'll have delivered all 7 workshops. But just as significantly, I think there's been a cultural change. So when I go out and visit hospices now, I often see OAK posters on the walls. Staff talk to me about the fact that they're actually just starting to implement OAK, or they're planning to. The Train the Trainer workshops I talked about were all fully booked up within weeks. Each of them has been oversubscribed. So I think there's a real sense that outcome measures are becoming mainstream. They're becoming something people want to do. People understand now that there is a movement afoot, and this is an important initiative which will continue. So we've changed, I think, a bit. We've moved on from let 100 flowers bloom to carefully cultivating a small number of selected plants. But looking to the future, I think we need to recognise that these plants are still delicate. So we need to think about, well, what can we do to cultivate and nurture them so we have more healthy growth? And what are some of the risks and threats which might stifle the flourishing and the growth of these plants? And I think there are 3 things I want to talk about. The first is about making sure that internally within the organisation, the full and strategic potential of OAK is really understood. The second is about making sure that potential is understood with external stakeholders as well. And the third is about making sure that together we develop the ongoing support and the resources needed to realise that potential. Now, making sure that the strategic potential is understood internally, I think actually this is one of the biggest risks. And this risk is that OAK is seen as something which is just for clinicians and just about improving the care of individual patients. I think clearly that is a really massive and important part of the use of outcome measures. And none of us would be doing this if it wasn't about driving improved care for patients. But if OAK is seen as purely something of interest to clinicians, just a clinical initiative, just about improving care on a case-by-case basis, then the huge strategic potential will be lost. Because actually, we can do so much more with these outcome measures. So we can think about gaining insight, gaining information, gaining knowledge, gaining intelligence about what's the case mix between your different services, what's it telling us? What are the findings telling us about the different skill mix you have allocated to different services? About your overall resource allocation, about service improvement and service development. What's it doing to inform your discussions with commissioners? How's it informing your thinking about your own staff's training and education needs? And indeed, if you offer education externally as well, about the education offer that you provide. How's it informing your research thinking, your research strategy? So if OAK's seen as just another set of tools, all this may be lost. And so I guess my question to hospices would be, is it something that you're just seeing as led and about and for clinicians? Is your chief executive involved in thinking about the use and the potential of outcome measures? Do the rest of the leadership team understand these things? Have they been involved in the discussions? Have they been educated about the potential and why OAK is so important and so different from some of the other measures which have been used? What about your board of trustees? How are you thinking, even if you're at the very early stages, are you thinking about how the potential, how the use is going to be shared with trustees, How are you going to integrate the findings into your reporting mechanisms? Is it through the whole board? Is it through specific committees? But how are you going to make sure that that strategic potential is understood at board level as well? And I get worried sometimes because I think there's still a tendency to mix up the Oak measures with assessment tools and not really understand the difference fully enough between outcome measures and assessment tools. And I sometimes hear hospices saying that they're not really decided whether to go with Oak or whether they might prefer to develop something like an end-of-life care outcome star. I see one hospice whose big plan was to introduce the distress thermometer across their services. Some people say they think Oak's a bit too clinical, not person-centred enough. So I think firstly it's really important to remember that some of the measures within Oak are specifically designed to be patient-reported measures whenever possible. But also, again, the point is that these are validated measures. They're based on years of research. They are designed so that the data can be aggregated and analysed at service level, at organisational level, and eventually, when we do get to the point of having that case mix adjusted, we can benchmark different services right across the country. And that's very, very different from things like the distress thermometer and the outcome star, where you may be able to look at the change for one individual person, but are not designed to be able to use the power of aggregation and analysis and data in anywhere near like the same way. So I think it's really important to all remember and educate our colleagues and think about those distinctions so that they're not just interchangeable tools. The next issue is about making sure that Oak is understood externally. And I like this picture because I think for me it captures something about, firstly, the elephant. So, you know, Oak is something which is heavyweight, but it's big and clunky and clumsy to introduce. It will take time. It's not swift and nimble and easy to bring in. It's not something you can do in 6 months. So there's something about the kind of awkwardness and difficulty and heaviness of bringing in that massive change. But also the tightrope of at what point do we actually open up discussions with commissioners about this? And I like the fact that this elephant is sort of on, you know, do we want to be on the front foot or the back foot here? Now, I think anyone would think you'd want to be on the front foot, but I think there's a fear that if we talk to commissioners too early, it will raise expectations. That commissioners, if you start to talk about the plan to introduce outcome measures now, in 12 months' time, they'll be saying, well, what are the findings? What have you done as a result? And I think that explains why there's maybe a bit of reticence in talking about outcome measures and plans to introduce them with commissioners at the moment. I think there's also a bit of worry about a rush to benchmarking. So we've said all along that there is this huge potential for national level benchmarking, but of course it has to be case mix adjusted. Otherwise you're not comparing apples and apples, you're comparing apples and pears. But clearly if different hospices and different providers start using the outcome measures and start talking to commissioners, and one or more provider in the same area start to use the outcome measures, then de facto you'll have commissioners start to compare what's happening and what's coming out of one with what's coming out of another. So I think there's a nervousness there about moving towards a position where we might end up having de facto benchmarking on a local level from different commissioners. But the answer to me is not to treat outcome measures like the elephant in the room, don't mention the outcome measures, but actually to open up those discussions now, to help educate commissioners, to help commissioners again understand the difference between the Oak suite and some other measures, and not to be in a position where all of a sudden commissioners are saying, well, actually this year we want you to introduce these outcome measures that we've chosen, which might be something completely inappropriate for a palliative care population. They might be something chosen or validated with people with cancer, but not more appropriate for wider use. But it's just, if we don't start talking and start explaining and start working with commissioners on this, then we will definitely end up on the back foot. And clearly, I think outcome measures are so important. The whole point from the Commission's findings about needing to have a much stronger evidence base, a much stronger story about the difference and the impact we make is something which is important for all the other stakeholder conversations we have too. So talking about funders, talking about conversations with regulators, and clearly as well the stories and the information we share with the general public and our local supporting communities. How many people, how many hospices talk about outcome measures within their quality accounts? Now, This is a quote from one CCG statement in response to a hospice quality account. "We were pleased to note the hospice's stated commitment to achieving the best possible outcomes for all its patients and those close to them. However, we were disappointed that no further information was given about how the hospice measures outcomes for patients, what outcome measurements tools they use, whether these are validated tools, and what steps the hospice has taken to understand and improve patient outcomes. So in the coming year, we look forward to discussing with the hospice how the introduction of validated outcome measurement tools might be used to inform care to support individual patients' needs and indeed service design and commissioning." But actually, I made that up. It's not a real quote at all. But I sometimes wonder, why don't we see more quotes like that? Because most hospices do talk about outcomes and the intention and the aspiration to improve outcomes in their quality accounts, but not that many yet are saying anything about what they're doing about it. And I think, again, it's only a matter of time before, if hospices don't open up those conversations and take the initiative and talk to commissioners about the kinds of outcome measures and about why this is a long haul and about actually why it'd be most valuable to work together with other providers in an area and with the commissioners to have a shared approach to introducing these, that these are the kind of statements and responses that hospices are going to see. And then my final point is about how can we develop the support and the resources to fully realise the potential of OAK. So in the Train the Trainer sessions, which we've been running jointly with Cicely Saunders Institute, we've been asking for people's feedback about what would they find useful going forward. And there's definitely a lot of interest in having more workshops and training support. It feels like we've only scratched the surface, really. All the workshops were fully subscribed very, very quickly. So there's clearly an ongoing high level of demand for training. But people have also talked about wanting more case studies, more written resources, maybe videos, some templates so that people can bring about some consistency and have some help in thinking about how to report the findings, both internally, their trustees and boards, and how they might present those externally. And there's also a lot of interest, a lot of desire to have ongoing shared learning. So we're thinking about how to create a community of practice for those interested and involved in using outcome measures. And would really welcome some thoughts and feedback during the course of today about other things or how that might be made to work. There's also interest in having some resources which are targeted specifically at commissioners so that we can explain together the value, the potential, the impact of outcome measures in palliative care and how they work, and something about how they might be, how they're different from maybe some of the other outcome measures that commissioners might be familiar with in other areas of healthcare. And I think one question which I'm really interested in is looking a bit further at whether all hospices have to use OAK in the same way. And I've been thinking about this, and I suppose my thoughts up to now are that it's really important that we all stay consistent in how we collect the data, because if we don't do that, if we start going off and adapting tools and tweaking them, going off in different directions, we're moving back towards the wildflower meadow. But actually then in how people make use of the intelligence and the findings, whether you are doing that to inform thinking about skill mix and resources and service development, whether you're using it to think about how to improve existing services, whether you're using it to inform thinking about new models of care, that will be very varied depending on where you are, what your other strategic plans are, what services you provide, and what you are doing in relation to others in the local health economy. So those ways of applying it will be very different. But again, always ultimately, again, at the bedrock, thinking about how to use it for ongoing improvement of care, both for individual patients and service improvement. That culture, that thinking, that ethos of continuous improvement and quality improvement is so important. And again, I think we need to move away from a sort of complacency that we can only, or we only really want to do this to demonstrate the fantastic value of what we do now. We need to be thinking about how to use that intelligence into the future in a strategic way. So finally, I think, looking to the future, we've got various possibilities and various opportunities. So the picture on the right is a bonsai oak. It's beautiful in its own way, it's perfectly formed, and I think if we treat the outcome measures as something which is just for clinicians to use, something just for improving care by patient, we'd end up with a whole load of bonsais. Something which is actually really, lovely in its own right, but stunted. The other picture is of an oak from Estonia, which was awarded the title of European Tree of the Year. So this is something mighty, something magnificent. And I think if we all work together and we share learning, we share knowledge, we share resources, we share mistakes, and come together and really try and realise the full potential of oak, we have the possibility of creating together something mighty and magnificent for patients. Thank you.